So today we're going to talk about porn and the porn industry and talking to kids about porn, which is a very important topic, but a really uncomfortable topic sometimes to jump into. But let's jump into it. I feel like a lot of people want to know at what age should you start to talk to your kids about porn?
I think just like anything, there are levels of information to give to children based on their age. And I think the problem that a lot of people have had in the past, especially like our parents and things like that, that they wait to talk to you about any of it until it's too late or until you've learned it already from other sources, or until it's very awkward to hear about from your parents. You don't talk about it. It's this taboo topic. And then suddenly they sit you down and you have this big, awkward, uncomfortable conversation. And I think the best way to kind of mitigate that is to start having those conversations from the very beginning, from when they're little, which is where you get into the conversations about body parts, correct names for body parts, talking to them about when is it acceptable to have someone else touching you, have when is it acceptable to touch yourself, all of those conversations that you can start having with them when they're very little, and then you just add to those conversations as they grow. So they're learning about all these things in a way that makes sense to them at the time, but it's introducing topics that you can build upon. That's going to make you more comfortable talking to your child about porn. It's also going to make your child more comfortable hearing from you because they're used to hearing conversations and they're used to hearing you bring up topics about their body, about sexuality, about gender expression, sexual orientation, all of these things. You're already talking about them regularly. And so they don't feel like, whoa, this is a weird, uncomfortable conversation that suddenly mom and dad are having. And it's not some, okay, everyone come and sit down. We're going to discuss something. It's just a conversation that is an ongoing conversation that you're building on.
Yeah, that comes back to the idea of the birds and the bees and the talk that you always hear about, the talk that you have to have with your kids when they're teenagers. And I feel like if you get to the point that you haven't had any of these conversations by the time they're a teenager, and then you have the talk, and it's just a one-time talk and then you never talk about it again, I feel like that kind of sets kids up for failure a little bit, that you're not giving them that much information and you're not making it normal to have these kinds of conversations, to have discussions about sex and sexuality at all. Because it is also where you get a lot of people that grow up and they are in relationships and they are starting to be sexually active and they don't know how to have these conversations. They've never had any conversations like this. And when they do, it's awkward and it feels like that sit down formal thing.
And also, if you're regularly having conversations with children about not just topics on sexuality and gender and those sorts of things, but if you're always having an open dialogue with your child about important topics, anything that kind of garners like a discussion with your child, they're used to that back and forth. They also are going to be more comfortable asking you questions. So when someone at school, maybe you have a kid who's like Finley, who's 8, and you think, well, they're kind of too young to be talking to about porn. It feels like they're not even experiencing sexual feelings. Like, that seems crazy to talk to them about this thing that's happening in the world. But maybe they have a friend at school who has an environment that they have seen a lot of things. Maybe they have internet access, all of these things, and they say something to our child. Well, that can be very confusing, not as something he doesn't understand. If we have always had these open dialogue conversations with him, it's so much easier for him to come home and be like, my friend Larry said this. What does that mean? I've heard that. If your child's asking, they're old enough to know. They're old enough to know the answer to some degree. Obviously, you don't need to sit them down and show them what porn looks like when they're 8 so they can recognize it. No, but you can talk to them about what it is, why people watch it, and some of the negative effects that it can have, things to be careful, all these conversations, like as your child asks you questions. And probably they're only going to be coming to you if they're experiencing this. Either they have seen it somewhere or they have friends talking about it.
And you brought up a really good point in that so many kids now have unlimited access to the internet at the age of 4, 5 years old, even younger than that. And so your kids are going to have friends who have unlimited internet access, and they're going to find things. They're going to see things that maybe your kids aren't seeing. And you can't guarantee when your kids are going to be exposed to pornography. You can't guarantee that it's going to be when they're a teenager. You can't guarantee that it's not going to be in their kindergarten classroom or in kindergarten on the playground. You really have no guarantee about that. You do need to think about at every age, what would their reaction be to this, and how would they process this, and how can you prepare for them for the possibility that they see something that they're not quite ready to see. And I think it's good that we bring that back into these conversations about bodily autonomy, about who is allowed to see your body, who's not allowed to see your body, that you shouldn't be touched without wanting to be touched. And young children understanding bodily autonomy is very important, because that carries over into this other conversation that very quickly, the conversation surrounding porn and the ethics of porn, gets into this conversation of bodily autonomy, of how much bodily autonomy porn stars have and how much they don't have. And then you get into trafficking. And we've talked to our son about how there are people who want to touch your body, and they have their own ideas of what they think they should be allowed to do with your body. And he has this understanding that those are not safe people, and they aren't allowed to do that. And so it does transfer over into this. He already understands that there are unsafe people who want to do things to other people's bodies that they don't have permission to do. And so when it goes into this conversation of pornography, then you have that, like, those same unsafe people watch videos of other people having things done to them that they didn't give permission for. So it is a little bit hard, because you want to have that, like, formal talk about porn, like you want to name it, you want to be like, this is pornography, that's what it is. But also you're kind of like introducing them to this concept that they don't yet have and that they don't really want to explore. And so finding that right balance of what words to use, how to talk about it, I think that's challenging, and at exactly what age to be at. I think we're at the point right now that I think it is important that we have this conversation with our son right now. And he's 8 years old, which sounds so young. It feels so young.
There are ways that you could open these conversations up in a way that isn't directly like pornography, but kind of talking to your child about nudity, and maybe art could be a good way to start that conversation with a younger kid, and talking about different ways that we express ourselves through our bodies, in art, in music. It's talked about in music, and these different ways that people use their bodies to communicate. That could open the door potentially for conversation, for questions to be asked that might be a little bit more, feel more organic as a parent than just being like, let's talk about porn to a child.
How would I approach this conversation of, like, I want to talk to Finley about what porn is? He's seen paintings of people who are nude, and then that brings you into this idea of, like, photographs of people who are nude. There are times and places that is appropriate. There's also times that is highly inappropriate and very illegal. I think sometimes kids are pretty good at coming up with their own ideas of what is ethical if you actually lay out different scenarios. If a person paints a picture of a woman nude and she wants to have a painting of herself nude, is that ethical? Is that okay? What do you think about that? What if she doesn't want anyone to see her body? Then is it okay? I feel like he would then be like, no, that's not okay. That would be a good place to start the conversation. The difference between ethical art practice and unethical art practice is if the model consents to being painted. I think that is something that he would understand, but it's also something that he grew up with. So I think finding those parallels, things that you could run through some ethical scenarios with him, and he can kind of start thinking about the ethics of people's bodies and sharing them.
Everyone probably has some kind of parallel that they can make. I feel like artistic expression is an easy way, even if you're not a big art family. I feel like art expression, because there's lots of paintings you can pull up on the internet or museums you can go to.
But I do think that the conversation that we need to have with Finley, that I think is a pretty universal conversation that we need to have with kids, I think especially with boys, is that at some point he's going to come in contact with a picture or a video of something pornographic, and just talking to him about the idea of what that is. Even just telling him at some point you might see a video of someone who is naked. Because sometimes people make those and sometimes people put them on the internet. That's something you might see someday. And tell him that often those are not ethical and they aren't done with permission. And sometimes the people that are in those pictures or in those videos did not give consent to be in those videos. And if he sees that, he needs to come talk to us. If someone shows him that, he needs to come talk to us immediately. That is the first thing that he should do. If it is an adult, especially if it is an adult, he needs to come talk to us. If it is a kid, he needs to come talk to us. And we probably then need to talk to their parents.
An easy way to start the conversation is just to ask your child if they have ever seen anything. Have you ever seen a photo or a video of someone naked on a computer, or have your friends ever talked about seeing something like that? And then if your kid is like, no, like, why would you? That still leads into a conversation. Or if they're like, oh yeah, I did see that one time, and make sure you're doing it in a way that's not like a gotcha, like they're not in trouble if they ever have. And I think your relationship with your child before this conversation is really important on how they're used to talking to you. But if you're a parent who has that open dialogue, then just a simple question is pretty easy. If you've had a relationship with your kid that maybe hasn't always been the strongest and they get in trouble for certain things, they might be hesitant to answer that question thinking, oh, if I say yes, I'm going to get in trouble. So that's important to note, like, how your relationship with your child is, but making sure that they know that it's okay if they have, that you just want to talk about it. And then going into all the things that you just said on why it's important that they share that with you, because there can be a lot of problems with that. And that there are some ways of having that kind of expression that is okay, and that's something to talk about too. But that you can't know just by seeing something if it is okay or not. And that's why it's important to investigate that and do that with you as the parent.
And then I think as he gets older, it will be less pointed. I think at this age, when he's very young, it's important to like intentionally prepare him for specific scenarios that may or may not happen, but having those conversations be more intentional then. As he gets older, I think I like the approach that we've had with some of our foster kids, where they seem inquisitive about something. They seem like this is a topic that they really need to explore. And so we would just have those conversations. And sometimes that's not like sitting them down and having a conversation with them, but like when we're all hanging out, if we're playing board games or if we're having dinner, that we have that conversation. I have a conversation with you. There's always reasons to have a conversation that, like, if we aren't really sure what we think about whether or not porn is ethical, well, then we can have that conversation. I can be like, where do you draw that line from when it is appropriate and when everyone is consenting and that it is safe, into something that is not safe, that is not ethical, and have that conversation, and just have the conversation about, like, how would we figure it out? How would we know if porn was ethical? If we wanted to find ethical porn, how would we find it? And us having that conversation just with them there, often they might chime in if they want to. They might enter into that conversation, but then it's not like us forcing them into the conversation, but they're always listening.
Also, something that we did was the topic of the day box, our Todd box. And so implementing that where you can put questions anonymously into the box. I think this would be even better if you had multiple children in the home, because then it's a little bit more like actually anonymous. But being able to add some of those questions yourself that you want your child to have asked, or you want to discuss, you can put those questions in yourself. That was always really meaningful in our household, and being able to openly talk. And it's a you have guidelines ahead of time that are set up that anyone can ask anything. No one will be in trouble for any question, and everyone just wants to put their ideas and thoughts out there. And it's a brainstorming session, and it's just a topic to discuss. It's not that anyone has the right answer. And that was really good for us in the flow of conversation in some of these big topics. And we would find that the kiddos would actually put in some really real questions. And so that's definitely something that people could do with their children. For us, we talk about so many things all the time at the dinner table. Like, Finley's constantly hearing us have conversations like this. So for him, if we start talking about porn, even when he gets older, if we're talking about porn at the kitchen table, he's probably just going to be like, oh yeah, well, this is my parents talk about this stuff. But thinking about families who are not open like that, who don't have these constant dialogues of conversation about important topics, and they're moving into this space, or they would like to, especially if they already have children who are preteen teenagers. Maybe if they're listening to this, they're saying, okay, yeah, that's great. That sounds great. But like, if I just start talking at the table about porn with my 15-year-old sitting there, they're going to be like, why is my mom and dad talking about porn at the kitchen table? So I think it would be helpful too to have some, I don't know, other kinds of advice for people who are going into a space that maybe they don't have that kind of relationship with their kid, or they haven't had that environment in the home.
Well, I think ultimately it comes down to instilling a really good understanding of consent with your kids, because it's really just an extension of that conversation. That idea of you have to consent for someone to touch your body, and you can't touch anyone else without their consent. So I think that's the other thing, making sure that you have the consent of other people before you do anything that involves someone else's body. And that's where you can transfer those same ideas over into this conversation of, if you see a picture of someone who is naked, do you have their consent to look at their body? And how would you know? If someone just shows you a picture on their phone, you have no idea where that picture came from. You have no idea if that person has consent to have that picture, or if they have the consent to share it. You do not have consent. And so if you see a video of someone, how do you know that you have the consent of that person to look at that video of their body? I think is a good starting place for this conversation.
And that made me think a lot, if you already have a teenager, bringing that exact topic up, but in the context of girls at their school, because we know that happens, that pictures get shared around at schools of girls without their consent, maybe guys too, that, oh, I sent this picture to my boyfriend and then we broke up and he sent it to all his friends. That definitely happens. That could be something that could be a topic that you bring up. Be like, hey, I just read an article. I feel like that's a good way to start any conversation. Be like, oh, I've read this article, or I saw this thing on TikTok, whatever, that has that ever happened at your school? Like, have you ever been sent a picture of somebody, like an unsolicited picture of somebody, or have you ever heard of this happening? They might be like, oh yeah, like I've gotten one of those, and that would be a way to talk about consent when you're talking about individuals that they know personally. Like, that's definitely a topic of consent. But then, like, you can zoom out on that's actually, that goes with the porn industry as well, that you don't always have their consent, and bringing in their kind of personal life with this bigger topic.
And all of the times that consent can be violated along the way, that they might have consented to the picture being taken, that doesn't mean that they sent it to someone. Someone might have taken a picture of themselves, and so they consented to have that picture taken, but that doesn't mean they consented for that picture to be sent to even their boyfriend, or for their boyfriend to send it to other people. You even have the idea of consent can be withdrawn at any moment. So they might have consented to that picture existing, but they don't anymore. They might have at that moment been okay with it, but then a year later, they're like, man, I wish I didn't have that picture out there. I no longer consent to people seeing this image. I no longer consent to people seeing this video, but it's 5, 10 years later and it's still floating around. So that's a scenario where even if they consented for the video to be shared, that doesn't mean that they currently consent to that video being shared.
And I think that's a twofold conversation as well for your child, that if they are making content like this, like as they're older, if you have a kid who's making content, sending out content, being a cautionary thing that you have the right to withdraw that consent at any time, that is your right. That doesn't mean that people will respect that right. And so once it's out there, you have to know that it's out there. And if you say, hey, I don't want you to see this anymore, please delete it off your phone. They should. They absolutely should. But that doesn't mean that they will. And then the flip side of that being like, if you receive pictures or videos from someone who has consented to give it to you, that's consent for you. Like, you absolutely should not share that with anyone else without that person's consent. And if at any time they say, hey, I don't want you to have that anymore, you delete it. No questions asked. And like, I feel like that's kind of on both sides of that coin, instilling in your child consent for their own body, consent for other people's body, and like, what's the appropriate course of action. We know that teenagers are doing this. They have all the access to do this, and they are. So I think that outside of the pornography conversation is a huge topic to bring up with your kids.
So I think when it comes to the question of when to start talking to your kids about porn, it's more of breaking the porn industry up into its individual parts and thinking about the things that you are teaching your kids at every age and how it funnels into those parts. We've had a lot of conversations. There's been a lot of conversations recently about the idea of bodily autonomy and consent when it comes to touching. We talk a lot with young kids about anyone touching them. Anyone touches you, we need to know about it right away. I think it's just introducing that idea of people photographing or videoing as an extension of not just touching. And so I think that's a conversation that Finley is 8, and I think he's ready to have that conversation about consent when it comes to photos and videos of bodies.
It's good for them to have that like idea of consent already there and well established in their vocabulary, in their mindset, so that it's an immediate like red flag that they sense like, oh, this is not okay, and I can share this with my parent.